In the year 108 after Christ, the Roman Empire fielded 28 legions. 60 years later, one of them was simply gone. No battle, no chronicle, no monument, no surviving sentence in any ancient author explains where it went or when it stopped existing. To understand how something that large could disappear without leaving a mark on the record, you first have to see the shape of the world it was disappearing from, and how much of that world one legion could be asked to hold. In the year 108, Rome was within a few years of the largest extent it would ever reach. The empire ran from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the mountains of Armenia, roughly 5,000 kilometers from end to end, and from the cold estuary of the Solway in northern Britain to the first cataract of the Nile in Egypt, another 4,000 kilometers north to south. Inside that outline lay something close to 5 million square kilometers of governed territory. The population is guesswork, but the usual modern estimates fall between 60 and 70 million people, which may have been a fifth or even a quarter of every human being alive on the planet at that moment. Those figures are estimates, and historians argue about all of them. What is not in dispute is the machinery that held it together. Something like 80,000 kilometers of surfaced highway, engineered with camber and drainage ditches and stone milestones, ran from the Scottish border to the Euphrates. Grain fleets moved wheat from Alexandria and from the ports of North Africa on an annual schedule that fed a city of 1 million people. A letter could travel from Rome to the Rhine in about a fortnight if it was urgent and the weather held, and the whole apparatus rested on 28 legions, roughly 150,000 citizen soldiers, matched by roughly the same number again of auxiliary troops recruited from the conquered peoples of the frontier. That is around 300,000 men under arms to police 3 continents, which is not many, and every emperor knew it. The legions were not spread evenly. They were stacked along the 2 great river lines and the eastern desert edge. The Rhine and the Danube together carried something like 16 of them, strung out over more than 2,500 kilometers of water. Syria and Cappadocia held the watch against Parthia. Egypt held too, because Egypt fed Rome, and 3 legions, an unusually heavy garrison for the size of the place, sat in Britain, on an island at the far northwestern corner of everything. Britain had been a Roman province for 65 years by then. The second Augusta lay at Caerleon on the River Usk in South Wales, watching the mountains. The 20th Valeria Victrix lay at Chester on the Dee, at the hinge between Wales and the north. And the third fortress, the northernmost permanent legionary base in the entire Roman world, stood where the river Fosse runs into the river Ouse, on a low gravel terrace high enough to stay dry when the rivers came up. About 80 kilometers inland from the North Sea. The Romans called it Eboracum. We call it York. 20 hectares of ditch, rampart, towers, and gates laid out in the standard rectangle with rounded corners that the Roman army built everywhere from the Sahara to the Tyne. 2 main streets crossing at the center, the headquarters building at the crossing, granaries with raised floors to keep the grain dry and the rats out, a hospital, workshops, a bathhouse, and barrack blocks in long ranks. Each block divided into 10 rooms, 1 room for each squad of 8 men, who shared a tent on campaign and a mess in garrison. 5,000 men, and around them a growing civilian town of traders, families, veterans, and slaves. From Rome to that gate was a journey of about 2,500 kilometers by road and sea, 6 weeks in decent conditions. North of the gate the road ran on into country. Rome had conquered twice and abandoned twice. The legion that held Eboracum was called Legio IX Hispana, the 9th legion, the Spanish one. It had been in existence, under that number, for more than 150 years. It had fought for Julius Caesar. It had mutinied against him. It had garrisoned the Danube, campaigned in North Africa, invaded Britain in the first wave, been cut to pieces by a British queen, rebuilt itself, marched further north than any Roman formation would ever march again, and then come back and built a city. And then it stopped appearing in the record, and nobody said why. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to follow that legion from end to end. We will look at what a Roman legion actually was, how many men stood in one, what they were paid, and what they were charged for. We will look at the golden eagle they carried and what it meant to lose it. We will go to Pharsalus, where the 9th stood on the losing wing of the battle that killed the Roman Republic and won anyway. We will go into the German forest where Rome lost 3 legions in a week and never use their numbers again, because that is the control case that makes this whole mystery strange. We will cross a river in Kent that took 2 days to force. We will stand on the road in East Anglia, where 2,000 men of the 9th were destroyed in an afternoon, and at Watling Street, where the revolt was broken. We will go north with Agricola, to the edge of the highlands, into a camp attacked in the dark, and onto the slope of Mons Graupius. We will look at 875,000 iron nails buried in a pit on the River Tay. We will read the last stone the legion ever signed, and then work through every scrap of evidence for what happened next, one at a time, including a roof tile in the Netherlands, the career of a Roman senator, a burning insurgency in Judea, and a massacre in Armenia 20 years later than anybody expects. We will find out what a soldier on that frontier ate, wore, believed, was owed, and complained about in writing. And we will take apart the modern legend, which is younger than you think, and which was manufactured out of a Victorian mistake and a very good novel. If you are enjoying this so far, a like helps the channel more than you would guess, and subscribing is the only reliable way to actually see the next long-form documentary we put out. And while you are down there, give us an answer to this. Of everything Rome ever lost, which loss do you think it felt most? The 3 legions in Germany, the eagles at Carrhae, or a legion that went so quietly that 2,000 years later we are still arguing about whether it died at all? Tell us in the comments, and then argue with each other about it, which is the entire point. Start with the thing itself, because the word legion has been worn smooth by 2,000 years of use, and the reality was very specific. A legion at full paper strength in this period was somewhere between 5,200 and 5,500 men, and it was built out of 10 cohorts. 9 of those cohorts were identical. Each held 6 centuries. Each century held 80 fighting men under a centurion, which gave 480 men per cohort. The first cohort was different. It was double-sized, 5 oversized centuries of about 160 men apiece, and it held the best of them, because the first cohort stood on the right of the battle line and carried the eagle. Attached to the whole formation was a small mounted element of about 120 horsemen who worked as scouts, escorts, and dispatch riders, and a large body of specialists. Because a legion was also an engineering corps. Surveyors, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, tile makers, glass workers, hunters to supply meat, clerks, who could write clean administrative Latin. A legion could build a bridge, a fort, an aqueduct, a road, or a city, and over the centuries they built all of those. The chain of command ran like this. At the top, a legate, a Roman senator appointed personally by the emperor, usually in his 30s, who would hold the command for 3 or 4 years and then move on to a governorship. Under him, 6 military tribunes, one of them a young man of senatorial family learning the trade, the other 5 from the equestrian order, the second rank of the Roman aristocracy. Alongside them, the camp prefect, and he was the important one. The camp prefect was an old professional promoted up through the centurionate, often in his 50s, and he was the man who actually knew how everything worked. Below that, 60 centurions in a strict order of seniority, at the top of which stood the primus pilus, the first spear, the senior centurion of the whole legion, a position of enormous prestige that carried a salary many times that of an ordinary soldier and a route into the equestrian class for the man who reached it. The soldiers themselves signed for 25 years. They had to be Roman citizens, or they were granted citizenship on enlistment, and most of them joined in their late teens or early 20s. Under the Emperor Domitian, the basic annual pay was set at 300 denarii, delivered in 3 installments a year. Out of that, the army deducted the cost of food, boots, replacement equipment, bedding, the unit burial fund, and a compulsory savings account held in the strong room under the standards, so that a man reaching the end of his service would have something even if he had no self-control at all. On discharge, he received a bonus, in cash or in land, worth several years of pay. Soldiers were forbidden to marry during service, a prohibition that stood for more than 2 centuries, and that everyone, including the officers, quietly ignored, which is why the cemeteries outside legionary fortresses are full of women and children. The equipment is familiar, and the weight is not. A legionary of this period wore segmented iron plate armor over a padded undergarment, or mail if his unit preferred it, an iron helmet with cheek pieces and a deep neck guard, and he carried a curved rectangular plywood shield faced with leather and rimmed with bronze. His weapons were two heavy javelins with long, soft iron shanks designed to punch through a shield and then bend so they could not be thrown back, and a short stabbing sword worn high on the right hip so it could be drawn without fouling the man beside him. He also carried on the march a stake for the camp palisade, a digging tool, a cooking pot, a mess tin, rations for several days, and a cloak. The total is usually estimated somewhere around 30 kilograms. He marched 25 to 30 kilometers a day carrying it, and then, at the end of the day, before he ate, he dug. That last detail is the one that explains Roman success better than any other. Every single night, in hostile country or friendly, the army built a camp. Surveyors went ahead and laid out the rectangle with measuring rods, marking the site of every tent line before the column arrived. Then the men dug a ditch, threw the spoil inward into a rampart, planted the stakes along the top and hung their shields on the outside. In the morning, they filled it in again. A Roman army on the march was never caught in the open at night, ever, unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. And when something did go catastrophically wrong, it was almost always because a Roman commander had allowed his column to be strung out in country where he could not form a line and could not build a camp. Remember that. It happens twice in this story. Now the eagle. Because you cannot understand what the loss of a legion meant to Romans without understanding the object at the center of it. Every legion carried a single eagle standard, the aquila, a sculpted eagle with wings raised, mounted on a pole. In this period, it was made of gold. It was carried by an officer called the aquilifer, a man of proven courage who wore an animal skin over his helmet, and it lived, when the legion was in garrison, in a small shrine at the center of the headquarters building, alongside the images of the emperor and the standards of the individual cohorts and centuries. That shrine was a temple. Soldiers swore their oath in front of it. The unit's savings were kept in a vault beneath it, because it was the one place in the fortress nobody would dare rob. The standards were oiled, decorated, garlanded on festival days, and treated as living things with a will of their own. This was not sentimentality. It was practical. The standards were how a formation was controlled in the noise and dust of an ancient battlefield, where nobody could hear an order from more than a few meters away. You watched the standard move forward, you move forward. And it was also how a Roman soldier's whole identity was organized, because he served for a quarter of a century in the same unit, and the eagle was the unit, in a way that outlived every man in it. Which is why losing one was the ultimate catastrophe. In the year 53 before Christ, at Carrhae in the Syrian desert, the Parthians destroyed a Roman army under Marcus Licinius Crassus and took 7 eagles. Rome did not get over it. 33 years later, Augustus negotiated their return, and he treated it as a victory on the scale of a conquest. He struck coins to commemorate it, put a temple up to receive them, and had the recovery carved onto the breastplate of the statue of himself that stands today in the Vatican museums, so that the moment is preserved in marble on the chest of the first emperor. So when a legion vanished from the Roman army list, the question that would have occurred to any Roman first was not how many men had died, it was where the eagle went. Now let us find out where this particular one came from. The 9th first appears in the historical record in the middle of the 1st century before Christ, in the army Julius Caesar took across the Alps in the year 58 before Christ. It was one of the 4 veteran legions he began with, alongside the 7th, the 8th, and the famous 10th, and it spent the next 8 years fighting its way from the Rhone Valley to the Rhine, from the Atlantic coast of Brittany to the Channel, and across it to Britain and back again. It was at the siege of Alesia in the year 52 before Christ, one of the most extraordinary engineering operations in military history, where Caesar built 2 complete rings of fortification, one facing inward to trap the Gallic army of Vercingetorix, and one facing outward to hold off the relief force, and won a battle on both sides of his own wall at once. The 9th was part of that. When Caesar turned on the Roman state in the year 49 before Christ, the 9th went with him. It fought in Spain, then crossed to Greece for the campaign against Pompey, and at Eboracum, on the Adriatic coast, it was very badly handled. Caesar had built a line of siege works to pin Pompey against the sea. Pompey found the weak point, attacked it from two directions at once, and the Caesarian line broke. The 9th took the worst of it. Casualties were heavy enough that afterwards Caesar brigaded it with the 8th so that the two together could function as one legion of normal size. And in that condition, understrength and recently beaten, it took its place on the left wing at Pharsalus in the summer of the year 48 before Christ. Look at the ground, because Pharsalus is a battle decided entirely by one piece of thinking. The armies faced each other on a plain in Thessaly with a river, the Enipius, running along one side. Caesar anchored his right on that river, which meant his right flank could not be turned. Pompey did the same on the opposite side, which meant that all the open ground, and therefore all the cavalry, was concentrated on the other end of the field. Caesar had about 22,000 infantry and 1,000 horsemen. Pompey had something like 45,000 infantry and 7,000 horsemen, and almost all of that cavalry was massed on his left, opposite Caesar's right, under Titus Labienus, who had been Caesar's own best general in Gaul and had changed sides. Pompey's plan was simple and should have worked. Hold the infantry line, send 7,000 cavalry around the exposed Roman right, ride into the rear of Caesar's army and roll it up from behind. Caesar could see it coming, because he could count horses, so he did something that no manual described. He took 6 cohorts, roughly 2,000 men, out of the third line of his infantry and posted them behind his right at an angle, hidden by the ranks in front, with orders not to throw their javelins but to hold them and use them as thrusting spears, and to aim at the faces of the enemy riders. The battle opened, with the infantry lines advancing. Pompey had ordered his men to stand and receive the charge rather than run at it, which was unusual, and Caesar's veterans, seeing that the enemy was not moving, stopped halfway of their own accord, dressed their ranks, got their breath back, and then went in properly. On the left, where the 9th stood shoulder to shoulder with the 8th, it was a straight grinding infantry fight against a longer line, and the men there had to hold and keep holding while the decision happened somewhere they could not see. On the right, the cavalry charge came in, drove Caesar's outnumbered horsemen back, and swung around the flank exactly as planned. And then the 6 hidden cohorts stood up and walked into them. Cavalry in this period had no stirrups, fought in loose swarming formation, and depended entirely on shock and on the enemy giving way. What they could not tolerate was disciplined infantry advancing into them with spear points at eye level. The horsemen recoiled, could not turn in the press, and broke, and the entire 7,000 rode off the field. Caesar's cohorts kept walking, into the exposed flank of Pompey's archers and slingers, then into the flank of Pompey's infantry line. At that moment, Caesar committed his third line, the reserve that had not yet been engaged at all. Pompey's army, hit in front by fresh troops, and in the flank by the flanking force it had itself intended to use, collapsed. Pompey rode back to his camp, sat down in his tent, and then, when the Caesarian troops came over the rampart, went out the back and fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on a beach by men he thought were coming to greet him. The Roman Republic effectively ended that afternoon on a plain in Thessaly, and the 9th Legion had spent the battle on the far end of the line holding, while a general who understood cavalry better than his opponent won it 200 meters away. That is the glory. Here is the other side of it. 2 years earlier, in the year 49 before Christ, camped at Placentia, in the valley of the Po, in northern Italy, the 9th had mutinied. The men had been under arms for nearly a decade. They wanted the discharge they had been promised, and the money they had been promised, and they refused to march. Caesar came to them in person and announced that the legion would be decimated, which meant that the men would be divided into groups of 10. They would draw lots, and each group would beat its own loser to death with clubs. It was the most feared punishment in the Roman army, precisely because it made the unit execute itself. Caesar then allowed himself to be talked out of it, and had 12 ringleaders executed instead. The legion went back to work, and served him faithfully for the rest of the war. That episode tells you something true about the Roman army that gets lost in the imagery. These were not machines. They were long service professionals with a very clear sense of what they were owed, and they withheld their labor when they judged the contract broken. And their commanders answered them with a mixture of theatrical brutality and negotiation. After Caesar's murder, the Ninth was disbanded, and its veterans settled on farmland in Picenum on the Adriatic side of Italy. Within a few years, the wars started again, and the young Octavian, Caesar's heir, and eventually the Emperor Augustus, called them back to the standards. The legion fought in the vicious little war around Perusia in Italy, then in the campaign against Sextus Pompeius in Sicily, and it was probably present for the final reckoning with Mark Antony that ended at Actium in the year 31 before Christ. And then, at some point in the 2 decades after that, it went to Spain. The northwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula was the last part of Spain Rome had not taken, and it took an enormous effort to finish. The Cantabrians and Asturians lived in hill country of ridge and gorge and dense forest. They fought as raiders rather than in pitched battle, and the war that ran from about 25 to 19 before Christ was a slow, grinding, valley-by-valley reduction with something like 7 or 8 legions committed, and the Emperor Augustus present in person for part of it. It was the kind of campaign where the Roman advantage in open battle counted for very little, and the Roman advantage in logistics, road building, and sheer persistence counted for everything. That is almost certainly where the name comes from. Hispana does not mean conqueror of Spain. It means roughly the Spanish one, the legion that had been stationed there, in the way that units acquire nicknames from where they spent a long, unpleasant posting, and it stuck for the next 200 years. Now the honest caveat, and it is worth stating once, plainly, because it affects everything else in this video. There is no continuous paper trail linking Caesar's Ninth to the Ninth Hispana that later marched into Britain. Legion numbers were reused. Units were disbanded and reconstituted. Different commanders in different civil wars raised legions with the same numerals at the same time, and there were periods when 2 formations called the Ninth existed simultaneously on opposite sides of a war. The Roman army did not keep the sort of continuous regimental archive that would let us prove descent, and even if it did, none of it survives. Most historians accept the connection as probable, because the geography and the chronology fit, and there is no competing candidate. It is not certain. When you hear that this legion fought at Alesia and Pharsalus, hold it with a slightly open hand. By the reign of Augustus, the Ninth had been transferred to the Danube, to the province of Pannonia, in what is now western Hungary, eastern Austria, and northern Croatia. That is a very different kind of posting. The Danube frontier was the longest and most dangerous land border the empire had. A river line running for well over 2,000 kilometers, with a great many peoples on the far side who had every reason to cross it. And legions sent there tended to stay for generations. And in the year 6 after Christ, that frontier nearly failed. The Pannonians and the Dalmatians rose together, and the revolt was so large and so well timed, catching the emperor's stepson Tiberius mid-campaign in Germany with his army facing the wrong way, that Rome came closer to a strategic collapse in the Balkans than at any point in the previous century. It took 3 years and something in the order of 10 legions to put it down, in a war of sieges and starvation and burnt country. The Roman writer Velleius Paterculus served as an officer through that campaign and therefore actually saw it, and his account describes an Italy genuinely frightened, holding emergency levies and enrolling freed slaves because there were not enough soldiers to go round. The Ninth was there for all of it, and then, 5 days after the last of the Dalmatian resistance surrendered, a dispatch rider came in from the north with news from Germany. In the late summer of the year 9 after Christ, the governor of Germany, Publius Quinctilius Varus, was moving his army from its summer camp on the river Weser back to winter quarters on the Rhine. He had 3 legions with him, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, together with 6 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 3 squadrons of cavalry, a full baggage train, and the crowd of traders, servants, women, and children who followed every Roman army everywhere. He had been told that there was a small local disturbance to put down on the way, slightly off his direct route, and that dealing with it would cost him a few days. He was told this by Arminius, a nobleman of the Cherusei. Arminius had served in the Roman auxiliaries as a commander of cavalry. He held Roman citizenship. He had been granted equestrian rank. He spoke Latin. and he had spent the previous months building a coalition among the German peoples for the specific purpose of destroying that army. Another German noble, Segestes, warned Varus directly that he was being betrayed and named the man. Varus did not believe him, and it is worth understanding why, rather than laughing at him. Arminius was, on paper, exactly the sort of provincial aristocrat the Roman system was designed to produce and rely upon. Believing him was not stupidity. It was the system working as intended, aimed in the wrong direction. The country the column entered was the worst possible ground for the Roman way of fighting. Wooded hills on one side, wet moor and bog on the other, a track that in places narrowed to the width of a single cart, and rain that did not stop for days, turning the surface to mud and swelling the streams. A column of that size with its wagons has been estimated at something between 15 and 20 kilometers from vanguard to rearguard. It could not form a battle line because there was no line to form on. It could not build a proper camp because there was no dry ground large enough. It could not see, and it could not concentrate because by the time an order reached the rear, the head of the column was an hour's march away. The Germans did not fight a battle. They ran an ambush. Over 3 or 4 days, in stages. They struck the flanks of the column out of the tree line, killed whoever was in reach, and vanished before a response could form. Then they did it again further along. The Romans fought their way forward, burning wagons to lighten the column, trying to reach open ground. On the last day, they reached a place we can now stand in. At Calcrease in Lower Saxony, archaeologists have excavated a narrow corridor of firm ground between a wooded hill and an impassable peat bog, in places only about 100 meters wide, along which any column would have had to funnel. Running along the base of the slope, they found the remains of a turf wall, built in advance, with drainage behind it, so that men standing on the hillside could throw and shoot down into the corridor from cover. Scattered across the ground below it, they found sling stones, spearheads, fragments of Roman military equipment, mule bones with their harness bells stuffed with grass to silence them, and coins whose issue dates stop exactly where they should. They found bone pits containing human remains that had lain exposed on the surface for years before burial. And they found an iron cavalry face mask that had once been covered in silver, which is now one of the most recognizable objects in European archaeology. Varus killed himself with his own sword rather than be taken. Something in the order of 15 to 20,000 men died over those days. Some of the officers were killed on altars in sacred groves. Some of the survivors were kept as slaves for decades, and a handful were eventually ransomed home as old men and forbidden by imperial decree from ever setting foot in Italy again. Now, hold on to this, because it is the control case for the entire mystery in this video. Rome lost 3 legions in a single week in the year 9 after Christ, and we know an extraordinary amount about it. We know the numbers of all 3 formations. We know the name of the commander, and the name of the man who trapped him, and the name of the man who tried to warn him. We know roughly where it happened, because a modern excavation found the sling stones. 6 years later, the general Germanicus led an army back to the site, and Tacitus describes what they found. The bleached bones lying in heaps where units had stood and fallen, broken weapons and horse limbs in the mud, and skulls fastened to tree trunks, and the soldiers burying men they could not identify, wondering whose remains they were handling. Suetonius records that Augustus, decades into a reign of overwhelming success, would let his beard and hair grow and beat his head against a door in the night. And the numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never issued to a Roman legion again. Not for the remaining 4 centuries of the Western Empire. That is what Roman military catastrophe looks like in the record. Loud, detailed, dated, geographically located, and permanent. Remember that for the next 90 minutes, because it is the reason this story is a mystery at all. The 9th spent the following decades doing entirely ordinary imperial work. In the year 20 after Christ, it was shipped from the Danube to North Africa, to the province covering modern Tunisia and eastern Algeria, to help deal with a man called Tacfarinas. He was a Numidian who had served in the Roman auxiliaries and deserted, and he had turned the desert margin into a raiding front, using exactly the tactics a man trained by Rome would use against Rome, refusing battle, hitting supply lines, and dispersing when pursued. It took years. The ninth stayed about 4 of them and went back to Pannonia, and Tacitus notes some grumbling in the province it had left about being stripped of its garrison. That was the 9th Legion Hispana at the beginning of the year 43 after Christ. A competent, long-serving, unremarkable frontier legion, with a couple of centuries of history behind it, garrisoning a river line in Central Europe. Nothing about it suggested a strange ending. Then the orders came to march to the coast of Gaul. The invasion of Britain was a political operation before it was a military one. The Emperor Claudius had come to the throne 2 years earlier in circumstances that embarrassed everybody involved. He was middle-aged. He had a limp and a stammer. He had been kept out of public life by his own family as a liability, and he had been found behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard after the murder of Caligula and made emperor essentially because he was available and related to the right people. He needed a military achievement with his own name on it, and it needed to be somewhere famous. Britain was the obvious answer. Julius Caesar had crossed the Channel twice, in the years 55 and 54 before Christ, and had come back both times without holding anything. To conquer Britain was therefore to finish what the deified Caesar had started, which put Claudius in the only competition that mattered in Rome, above the greatest name in Roman history. There were also real strategic and economic arguments about grain and metals and hunting dogs and slaves, and about British kings sheltering enemies of Rome, and a genuine invitation from an exiled British ruler asking for restoration. But the reason it happened in the year 43 was the emperor's position in Rome. 4 legions were assembled at Boulogne under the overall command of Aulus Plautius, an experienced and unspectacular senator, which is exactly what you want for this kind of job. The Second Augusta, commanded by a hard, unglamorous officer from an undistinguished Italian family named Vespasian, who would be emperor within 30 years. The 14th Gemina, the 20th, and the 9th Hispana brought across the entire width of the empire from the Danube, a redeployment of well over 2,000 kilometers on foot. With auxiliary regiments, engineers, artillery and supply, the whole force came to something like 40,000 men, and it was assembled with a fleet to lift it across the channel. It very nearly did not go. The army mutinied on the beach. The soldiers refused to board, on the entirely reasonable grounds that they were being ordered to sail off the edge of the inhabited world into an island that Romans genuinely regarded as being beyond the ordinary limits of geography. The deadlock lasted long enough that the imperial freedman Narcissus, the most powerful bureaucrat in the empire and a former slave, came up onto the commander's platform to address them. The troops began jeering at the sight of an ex-slave in the place of a general. The whole thing dissolved into a joke, the mood broke, and they boarded. They sailed in 3 divisions, probably from Boulogne, and landed most likely at Richborough on the eastern tip of Kent, where excavation has found the invasion beachhead, a pair of long defensive ditches cut across the neck of what was then a promontory beside a sheltered channel. A great monument was later raised on the same spot to mark the gateway of the province. Some historians argue for a second landing further west, near Chichester, in the territory of a friendly ruler, and there is a reasonable case for it. Either way, the army came ashore against no serious opposition, because the Britons had not believed they were coming. Then it moved inland and northwest, and at the first serious river, it found the British army waiting. The river was almost certainly the Medway in Kent. It is tidal in its lower reaches, it was unbridged, and the ground on the far bank suited defense. The British forces were commanded by 2 brothers, Caratacus and Togodumnus, sons of the late king Cunobelinus of the Catuvellauni, the most powerful dynasty in southeastern Britain, and they had made a rational assessment. A Roman army could not cross a substantial tidal river without building a bridge. Building a bridge under observation would take several days. Those days could be used. So they camped along the far bank in loose order, watching, in no particular hurry. They were wrong for one specific reason. Claudius had Batavians. The Batavians were auxiliaries recruited from the Rhine Delta in what is now the Netherlands, a people whose entire treaty relationship with Rome was built on supplying soldiers. Their speciality, drilled and famous throughout the army, was crossing rivers in full equipment and formation, swimming with their horses, keeping unit cohesion in the water, and coming ashore ready to fight, rather than as a scattering of exhausted individuals. It was the single hardest thing a unit could do, and they were the best at it in the empire. Claudius sent them in downstream, out of sight of the British camp. They crossed, came ashore behind the British left, and then did something that reads as unheroic and was devastating. They did not go for the warriors. They went for the horses. The British battlefield weapon of consequence was the chariot. It was a light two-horse vehicle with a warrior and a driver, used to carry a noble fighter along the line at speed, let him fight or throw, and pull him out again, and it required a matched, trained pair of ponies and a great deal of practice. It made the British army mobile, and it made the British aristocracy dangerous. The Batavians got in among the horse lines and killed and hamstrung the animals at the picket. In an hour, before the battle had properly started, the enemy's mobile arm ceased to exist. With the far bank in disorder, Vespasian took the Second Augusta across, at a crossing point further upstream, and established a bridgehead. And here the account gets interesting, because the Britons did not run. They came back at the bridgehead and fought it out through the rest of the day. And then, when night ended the fighting, they came back the next morning and fought all over again. That is remarkable, and it is usually skipped. Ancient battles almost never lasted 2 days. They were decided in a few hours by one side losing its nerve, because holding a line under that kind of pressure with edged weapons at arm's length is beyond most armies for very long. 2 days means both sides were prepared to keep going, and it means the Britons at the Medway fought the Roman army to a standstill for an entire day and then chose to do it again. On the second day, a senior officer named Hosidius Geta was cut off in the fighting and very nearly captured, fought clear, and led the attack that finally cracked the British line. He was awarded triumphal honors for it, an extraordinary distinction for a man who had not yet held the consulship, and the award is itself evidence of how hard the battle had been. 2 cautions about all of that. First, our only narrative source for the invasion is Cassius Dio, a Greek-speaking Roman senator who wrote roughly 150 years after the events, using sources we cannot check, because the books of Tacitus that covered the invasion are lost. Second, notice what actually decided the battle, not Roman courage and not British cowardice. A specialist unit used for the one thing it was uniquely good at, aimed at the enemy's transport instead of at his soldiers. The Britons pulled back to the Thames and tried to hold that line too, using fords and causeways they knew and the Romans did not. The Batavians went across again. Togodumnus was killed in the fighting or shortly after. Caratacus got away west, and he would keep the war going for another 8 years. And then Aulus Plautius halted his army on the Thames and waited, under orders, because the emperor was coming to take the surrender in person. Claudius crossed Gaul, came over the Channel, joined the army, and led it across the Thames and north to Camulodunum, the capital of the Catuvellauni, which is modern Colchester in Essex. He brought elephants, which had never been seen in Britain, and were there entirely for the effect they would have on the people watching. He accepted the submission of a group of British rulers, and he went home. He was in Britain for 16 days. In Rome, a triumphal arch was raised to commemorate it. Part of its inscription survives, and it states that Claudius received the surrender of 11 kings of Britain, conquered without any loss, and that he was the first to bring barbarian peoples beyond the ocean under Roman rule. That is the official version of the campaign, carved in stone in the center of a city 1,100 kilometers from the men who had crossed the Medway, and it is a useful reminder of the relationship between Roman monuments and Roman events. Now the 4 legions separated, and the map of Roman Britain begins to be drawn. Vespasian and the Second Augusta went southwest into Hampshire, Dorset, and Devon, into the country of hill forts. Suetonius, writing later, credits him with 30 battles, the subjugation of 2 warlike peoples, the capture of more than 20 hill forts, and the taking of the island of Vectis, which is the Isle of Wight. At Maiden Castle in Dorset, one of the largest hill forts in Europe, a Victorian and later excavation found a cemetery outside the eastern gate containing bodies with battle injuries, one of them with an iron catapult bolt lodged in the spine, and for most of the 20th century that was presented as the archaeological proof of Vespasian storming the fort. Modern work has complicated that considerably, and the burials may not all belong to a single event, but the bolt in the spine is real. The 14th and the 20th pushed up through the Midlands towards the Welsh border, following the natural line of advance towards the mountains where the resistance was hardening. and the IX Hispana was given the northeast. It moved up through what is now Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, across fen and low country cut by slow rivers, building forts as it went. And by about the year 48, it had established a substantial base at Longthorpe, near modern Peterborough, an enclosure of about 11 hectares, big enough to hold half a legion with cavalry. This is what a legion actually did most of the time, not battle. Survey, road building, fort construction, escort duty, tax collection, patrol, and the endless slow business of turning conquered ground into administered ground. Meanwhile, in the west, the war refused to end, and the reason was Caratacus. He had lost his kingdom in the southeast, and he did not stop. He went into what is now Wales and made himself the leader of resistance among peoples who were not his own. First, the Silures in the south, a formidable and stubborn confederation in the valleys of the southeast of the country, and then the Ordovices in the mountains of the north. He fought a guerrilla war for years, refusing pitched battle, using the terrain, and the Romans could not finish it because you cannot force a decision on an enemy who declines to be found. Then, in the year 50 after Christ, he decided to fight one. Tacitus describes the position he chose, and it is a masterpiece of defensive site selection. Somewhere in the Welsh borderland, exact location unknown despite 2 centuries of argument, Caratacus put his army on a hillside. In front of it ran a river with a difficult bed. Where the natural slope was gentle enough to climb, he had stone walls built across it. Behind those walls, the tribes were drawn up in ranks, and above them the ground rose into broken high country where cavalry could not operate and a beaten army could disperse. He had chosen a position where the Roman advantages in formation fighting, artillery, and cavalry were all reduced at once, and he had made his men build fortifications, which the Roman governor Publius Ostorius Scapula noted with unease when he saw them. The Roman army came up to the river and hesitated. Tacitus says the soldiers pushed for the assault, which is the sort of thing Roman writers always say. They forced the river crossing under missile fire from above, which was the dangerous part, and took casualties doing it. Then they reached the stone walls, and here the battle turned on equipment and training rather than courage. The legionaries formed the testudo, locking shields overhead and in front, and advanced up to the wall under a roof of shields, while the Britons threw down at them and achieved very little. They pulled the loose stone walling apart with their hands and with tools, and got through. Above the walls, the Britons were caught in the open on the slope, and now the Roman equipment advantage told completely. The British warrior had no body armor, and often no helmet, and his shield was small. Against auxiliaries with spears and legionaries with heavy javelins and short swords, at close quarters, on a slope, with no fortification left to hold, there was no way to win. The line broke, and the army came apart and ran into the hills. Caratacus escaped again. His wife, his daughter, and his brothers were captured. He went north to the Brigantes, the great confederation of northern England, and asked their queen Cartimandua for protection, and she put him in chains and handed him to the Romans. Because her power rested on her relationship with Rome, and he was worth more as a gift than as an ally. He was taken to Rome and paraded, and then something unusual happened. He was brought before Claudius, and instead of being executed after the parade in the normal way, he and his family were pardoned and allowed to live in Italy. Tacitus reports that he made a speech, and reconstructs one, in which Caratacus argues that a man of his rank and resources resisting capture was exactly what Rome would have expected of a Roman, and that if he had surrendered at once, neither his fall nor Rome's glory would have been worth remembering. Roman historians composed speeches for their characters as a matter of convention, so what you are hearing there is Tacitus, not Caratacus. But the pardon is a fact, and it is the most interesting thing in the story, because it tells you the Roman state could recognize an opponent as a peer when it suited it. Back in the northeast, the Ninth pushed on from Longthorpe. Within roughly a decade, the legion had moved up to the ridge above the river with them, at a place the Britons called something like Linden, meaning the pool, which the Romans turned into Lindum, Lincoln. There, the Ninth built its first proper legionary fortress in Britain, on the hilltop where the medieval cathedral now stands, and the modern city still uses the Roman street alignment and one of the Roman gates. By the late 50s, Roman Britain had a shape. The road that later generations called the Fosse Way ran from Exeter in the southwest to Lincoln in the northeast, a remarkably straight diagonal of about 330 kilometers. And for a period it functioned as a working frontier, with everything to the south and east of it under civil administration, and everything beyond it a military problem for later. The 9th Legion held the northern anchor of that line. And then, in the year 60 after Christ, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus took the striking power of the province 400 kilometers in the opposite direction to the far northwest coast of Wales to destroy the Druid sanctuary on the island of Anglesey. Tacitus describes the crossing of the Menai Strait, the flat-bottomed boats for the infantry, the cavalry fording and swimming, and on the far shore, a line of armed men, with women running among them in black, with their hair loose, carrying torches, and Druids raising their hands and calling down curses, and Roman soldiers standing still with their limbs frozen in shock until their officers shamed them into moving. Then the sacred groves were cut down. It is one of the most cinematic passages in Latin literature and one of the most quoted, and it is worth noticing that Tacitus was about 5 years old at the time and is writing more than half a century later. While the army was on that beach, at the far end of the province, a courier was riding east with news that the Iceni had risen. The Iceni lived in what is now Norfolk and the northern part of Suffolk, in flat, rich, well-populated country on the edge of the fens. They had never been conquered. They had come to terms with Rome early, during the invasion, and their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a client of the empire, which meant he kept his throne, his people kept their weapons. Rome kept the peace cheaply, and everybody understood that the arrangement lasted as long as the king did. When Prasutagus died, around the year 60, he left a will naming the Emperor Nero as joint heir alongside his 2 daughters. That was the standard defensive move of a client ruler trying to protect his family, giving the empire a share in the hope that it would not take the whole thing. It did not work. According to Tacitus, Roman officials treated the kingdom as a bequest in full. The estates of the leading Iceni were confiscated, the king's relatives were treated as slaves, the royal household was plundered, and when the king's widow protested, she was flogged, and her 2 daughters were raped. Her name was Boudica, and it appears to derive from a British word, meaning victory. Cassius Dio adds a financial dimension which is at least plausible and may have been decisive. Roman moneylenders had pushed large loans onto the British aristocracy in the years after the conquest, on the assumption that Romanization would be paid for by the Britons themselves, and now, sensing instability, they called them in simultaneously. Dio names the philosopher Seneca, Nero's tutor and one of the wealthiest men in the empire, as holding 40 million sesterces of British debt and calling it in harshly. Dio is writing much later and clearly enjoys the hypocrisy of a moralist as a loan shark, so treat the detail with caution, but the general picture of a debt crisis on top of a land seizure is entirely credible. Sitting on top of all that was Camulodunum. Colchester had become a colonia, a settlement of discharged Roman soldiers given land as their retirement bonus, and that land had been taken from the Trinovantes who lived there. Veterans, Tacitus says, drove the locals off their farms and out of their homes, and called them prisoners and slaves, and the serving soldiers in the area encouraged it because they expected the same treatment when their own time came. And in the middle of the town stood the temple of the deified Claudius, an enormous classical building on a raised platform, paid for by British taxation, staffed by British aristocrats who had been made priests of the imperial cult and were ruined by the cost of the ceremonies. Tacitus says it was regarded as a citadel of eternal servitude, which is his phrase for what he thought they felt. The rising, when it came, was not a raid. It was a national war, and it moved with terrifying speed, and the Trinovantes joined it immediately. Camulodunum had no walls. Nobody had ever built any, because there had been no reason to build any, and the ditches of the old legionary fortress had been leveled when the town was laid out. There were a few hundred elderly veterans, a small number of officials, and 200 lightly equipped troops sent from London by the procurator when the trouble started. Tacitus records omens beforehand, the Statue of Victory falling over backwards as if fleeing, strange sounds in the theater, a vision of ruins in the estuary, and the sea running red. Whether people saw these things or remembered seeing them afterwards is unanswerable, but the panic is real. The town was taken and burned. The survivors got into the temple precinct, the strongest building available, and held out there for 2 days before it was stormed. Everyone in it was killed. That destruction is one of the most legible events in British archaeology. Dig anywhere in central Colchester, and you hit it. A layer of scorched red clay and daub, melted glass, carbonized grain and dates, and figs from a burnt shop, roof tiles fused together. A bright and unmistakable seam in the soil at the level of the year 60, and 120 kilometers to the northwest, at the base of the 9th Legion, a courier arrived, and Quintus Petilius Cerialis had to make a decision. Cerialis was the legate of the 9th. He was connected by marriage to the family of Vespasian. He was personally brave, and on the evidence of a long and successful career, he was consistently too quick. He was also the nearest Roman commander to a burning colony full of Roman citizens, with the governor and the field army 400 kilometers away in Wales, and no possibility of instructions arriving in time. So he marched. He could not take the whole legion, because the rest of it was holding a frontier, and legions were almost never in one place anyway. He took what Roman commanders, in a hurry, always took, a strong detachment, and the best modern estimate, worked backwards from the replacement drafts that arrived afterwards, is somewhere around 2,000 legionary infantry with about 500 cavalry. They went southeast, down a Roman road, at legionary marching pace, into country that had risen behind them. Here is the difficulty, and this channel will not pretend otherwise. Tacitus gives this disaster 2 sentences. He does not name the place. He does not describe the terrain, the day, the enemy commander, or the sequence. Everything beyond the bare fact is inference from how Roman columns were destroyed elsewhere. Hear the next few minutes as reconstruction, because that is what it is. What we can say with confidence is that the column never got to fight the battle it was built to fight. A legion on the march is not a legion in line. It moves as a column 4 men abreast, and a force of 2,000 men with baggage and cavalry occupies more than 3 kilometers of road from front to back. To convert into a battle line, it wheels its cohorts out to left and right and dresses them, and that maneuver requires 2 things, open ground and time. In enclosed country, with woodland or scrub, or banked field boundaries pressing close on both sides, it requires more time. An ambush is precisely an operation designed to deny both. Picture it from inside the column. You are in the 4th cohort, somewhere in the middle. You cannot see the vanguard, and you cannot see the rear guard. Your shield is in its leather cover, slung. Your helmet may be hanging from your shoulder, because men on a long march do not wear iron on their heads all day. Your javelins are over your shoulder with your kit bundle. Ahead, the sound of the march changes, and then the men in front of you stop, which means the road is blocked, and the officers are already shouting the order to form line before anyone knows why. And at that moment, the ground on both sides erupts. The heavy javelin is a formation weapon. It needs a target at 20 or 30 meters, and a man with room to bring his arm back. There is a man at 3 meters. The short sword is a formation weapon. It works because the man on your right covers your open side with his shield, while you stab past your own shield rim into whoever is in front of you. If the century comes apart, you are one man with a very short blade in a crowd, and every one of your advantages has evaporated. This is the thing to understand about Roman infantry defeats. Roman soldiers did not lose because the enemy was braver. They lost when the machine was prevented from assembling, and once it failed to assemble, the fighting quality of individuals barely mattered. The column would have broken into pockets, each fighting on its own, each surrounded, each eventually overwhelmed. There would have been a long, ugly period, perhaps an hour or 2, in which the outcome was already certain and the killing was not yet finished. The infantry were destroyed, all of them. Tacitus says so without elaboration or comment, and the figure implied by the replacement draft later sent from Germany is around 2,000 men. The cavalry survived, because cavalry can leave, and Cerialis left with them. He rode back to his fortified base, shut the gates, and stayed there for the rest of the war. It is easy to be contemptuous about that, and Roman writers were. it is also worth being fair to him. He had marched to protect Roman citizens who were being massacred. He had been beaten by a commander who chose the ground and used it properly. Nobody knows who that commander was, and the sources give the credit to Boudica because she was the name attached to the war. Cerialis did not lose his career over it, and he did not lose his nerve permanently, and we know that because 11 years later he came back to Britain in command of the entire province. The revolt rolled on. Suetonius Paulinus, riding ahead of his army, reached Londinium, which was not yet the capital but was already a substantial trading town at the lowest bridging point of the Thames, full of merchants, shipping, and money. He looked at what he had, did the arithmetic, and decided that he could not hold it. Tacitus says he resolved to sacrifice one town to save the province, and that he took with him those who could march and left the rest, and that those who stayed because they were old or attached to the place or unwilling to leave their property were destroyed. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, a town of Britons who had accepted Roman citizenship and Roman ways, went the same way and was hated for the same reason. 3 cities burned. Tacitus gives 70,000 Roman citizens and allies killed. The number is almost certainly too high, but the fire layers under modern Colchester, London, and St. Albans are real, and so is the fact that Colchester was not properly rebuilt for years. The final battle was fought somewhere along the road we now call Watling Street, and its site has never been identified despite an enormous amount of searching. Suetonius had about 10,000 men, the 14th Gemina, detachments of the 20th, and whatever auxiliaries he could gather. He had sent orders to the 2nd Augusta in the southwest to join him, and the acting commander there, a camp prefect named Poenius Postumus, did not come. We do not know why. He may have judged the roads impassable. He may have thought the province already lost and his men better used holding what he had. Suetonius chose his ground with enormous care, and the choice of ground is the whole battle. He put his army into the mouth of a narrow defile, with dense woodland behind him and rising ground on both flanks, and he formed up with the legionaries in close order in the center, the light-armed auxiliaries on either side of them, and the cavalry massed on the wings. Look at what that position does. It makes it impossible for the Britons, who had overwhelming numbers, to use them, because they cannot get around the flanks, and they cannot get into the rear. Woodland behind him also meant no ambush from behind, and no line of retreat, which concentrates the mind of every man in the line. The Britons came on in a mass so confident of the outcome that they had brought their families to watch, and they had drawn up their wagons in a long line across the rear of their own position to serve as a grandstand. The Romans stood still and let them come, and that stillness was doctrine, not nerve. As the mass funneled into the narrowing ground and its front rank came within 20 meters, the legionaries threw their javelins into a target so densely packed that a miss was almost impossible. The javelin heads punched through the small British shields and bent, so that a man's shield was suddenly unusable and had to be thrown away, and now he was facing armored infantry with no protection at all. Then the legionaries advanced in wedges, driving into the disordered mass, and the auxiliaries closed in from the sides, and the cavalry with lances rode in on the wings. The British host was pushed back into itself. Men at the front could not retreat because the mass behind them was still pressing forward, and men at the back could not advance because the front was collapsing. And then the whole thing broke and ran and reached the line of its own wagons and could not get through. Tacitus reports almost 80,000 Britons killed against 400 Romans dead and a similar number wounded. Take that pair of figures for what it is, a triumphal claim, the sort of arithmetic that appears in a dispatch to an emperor rather than in a count of bodies. The battle was real, the outcome was total, and the ratio is propaganda. Boudica died shortly afterwards, by poison according to Tacitus, of illness according to Dio, which is a polite way of saying that nobody knew. Poenius Postumus, learning that the battle had been won without him and that his legion had missed its share of the credit, fell on his sword. The reprisals that followed were severe enough that the new procurator of the province wrote to Rome about them, and Suetonius Paulinus was replaced, on the recommendation of an imperial commission, by a governor with instructions to calm things down. That is an interesting decision by the Emperor Nero, who was not usually credited with restraint. The province was too valuable to burn twice. And the 9th Legion, which had lost around 2/5 of its fighting strength in a single afternoon on a road, was put back together. 2,000 legionaries were shipped in from the army of Germany, along with 8 auxiliary cohorts and 1,000 cavalry, and the units were reorganized over the following winter. That fact is more important to this story than anything else in the Boudican Revolt, so let us be explicit about it. The Roman army could absorb the annihilation of a legion's entire field force and have that legion functioning again inside a year. Casualties did not delete a legion. A legion was an institution with a name, a number, an eagle, an archive, a bank, and a religious calendar. And as long as the eagle and the cadre survived, you poured new men into it, and it continued. Hold that thought, because when we get to the theories about how the ninth ended, it rules out the simplest one. For most of the following decade, Britain was quiet in the way an exhausted province is quiet. Then, in the year 69 after Christ, the empire tore itself apart. Nero was dead, and 4 men held the throne inside 12 months, and the legions of Spain, of the Rhine, of the Danube, and of the East marched on Italy to fight one another. Britain sent troops to that war and got very few of them back. The 14th Gemina, which had won at Watling Street and had an extremely high opinion of itself as a result, left the island permanently. And while the garrison was thinned and the province was watching Rome, the northern settlement collapsed. The Brigantes were the largest tribal grouping in Britain, a confederation covering nearly the whole of northern England, from the Mersey and the Humber up to the Tyne, hill country and river valleys and moorland. And for a generation they had been managed rather than conquered. Their queen Cartamandua was loyal to Rome, had been rewarded for it, and had handed over Caratacus in chains. Her authority depended on Roman backing, and everyone knew it. She divorced her husband Venutius and married his armor-bearer, a man named Velicatus, and elevated him to the kingship beside her. Whatever the personal story was, and there certainly was one, the political effect was to hand Venutius a cause. He had been hostile to Rome for years, and now he had a legitimate grievance and a moment when Rome was distracted. He raised a rebellion and brought in fighters from outside the Confederation. Roman auxiliaries were sent and managed to extract Cartamandua herself. Tacitus, in a single dry sentence, records that the throne went to Venutius and the war to the Romans. That could not be left. A hostile power controlling the whole of the north sat directly on top of the province, and every road and supply line in the north of England ran through territory that had just changed sides. So, in the year 71, the new Emperor Vespasian, who had commanded the Second Augusta in the invasion and knew Britain personally, appointed as governor the man who had ridden away from an ambush 11 years earlier. Quintus Batilius Cerialis returned to Britain, bringing with him the Second Adiutrix, a legion newly formed out of naval crews, and he took the IX Hispana north. This is the campaign that put the legion where it would spend the rest of its known existence. And the geography is worth following carefully, because the shape of northern England dictates it. The Pennine Hills run north to south like a spine and split the north of the country into 2 corridors. Any army moving north has to choose the eastern corridor, up through the Vale of York, or the western corridor, up through Lancashire, and the passes between them are few and difficult. Cerialis went up the east. From Lincoln, the advance moved north across the Humber, then up the flat, fertile, easily supplied Vale of York. And somewhere around the year 71, it halted at the gravel terrace between the Ouse and the Fosse, which was the last defensible dry ground before the country opens out, and which had river access to the sea for supply. There, the 9th Legion began to build. Turf ramparts and timber towers first, in the standard rectangle of about 20 hectares. Oriented so that the 2 main streets crossed at the center in front of the headquarters building. Granaries with buttressed walls and raised floors, workshops for iron and leather, a hospital, barracks in long ranks, officers' houses with courtyards, a bathhouse. Within a generation, there was a bridge over the Ouse, and a civilian settlement across the river, and within 2 centuries, it was one of the great cities of the Western Empire, Eboracum. It has been continuously occupied ever since, which is why the modern street plan of York still bends where a Roman fortress corner used to be, and why the medieval city walls sit on top of Roman ones. The campaign against the Brigantes went on for several years, and we know very little about it, because the relevant part of Tacitus is a summary rather than a narrative. He says Cerialis fought many battles, some of them bloody, and brought a large part of the Brigantes either under Roman control or into the war zone. The most spectacular monument that might belong to this war sits at Stanwick in North Yorkshire, at the point where the eastern corridor narrows towards the River Tees. It is an earthwork enclosure of some 300 hectares, surrounded by nearly 10 kilometers of rampart and rock-cut ditch, in places 6 meters deep, faced with dry stone walling. It is one of the largest fortified enclosures in Iron Age Europe. The traditional interpretation, which held for decades, was that this was the stronghold of Venudius, hastily extended for the final war, and that Cerialis stormed it. Later excavation has complicated that considerably. The dating is argued over. Some of the works look more like a display of status than a defensive system, and the evidence for a violent end is thinner than the original excavator believed. What is not in doubt is that within a few years of the campaign, the Brigantes were inside the province, and the frontier had moved something like 150 kilometers north. Cerialis was succeeded by Sextus Julius Frontinus, who turned the effort west and finally broke the Silures of South Wales, planting a legionary fortress at Caerleon on the Usk for the Second Augusta, and building the road network that pinned the Welsh mountains between garrisons. Frontinus is worth a sentence of his own, because he later wrote a technical manual on military stratagems and a treatise on the water supply of Rome that is one of the most useful engineering documents to survive from antiquity, and he was appointed to run the aqueducts as an old man and approached the job like a general. By the year 77, the province reached the Tyne. Then Rome sent a governor who did not think that was far enough. Gnaeus Julius Agricola arrived in the year 78, and he is the best documented Roman official in the entire history of the province, for one reason that you must keep in mind for everything that follows. His biography was written by his son-in-law, Cornelius Tacitus, and published in the year 98. It is a magnificent piece of Latin. It is the only continuous narrative of the conquest of the North that survives, and it is a defense of a dead relative's reputation, written by a man who was not there under a new regime, at a moment when Tacitus had his own reasons for contrasting a decent public servant with the emperor he had served. Every casualty figure in it, and every noble speech put into the mouth of a Briton, should be handled with tongs. With that established, the campaign it describes is real, and it is one of the great overland advances in Roman history. The first season went west, to finish Anglesey, which had been abandoned half-done when Boudica rose. Agricola arrived late in the campaigning year, when everyone expected him to wait for spring, caught the Ordovices of North Wales unprepared, and then took the island by sending auxiliaries who could swim across the strait without boats, which is the Batavian trick from the Medway used again. The second season pushed north through the Pennines and up towards the Tyne and the Solway, and Tacitus makes the specific claim that no fort Agricola cited was ever taken by storm, or surrendered under terms, or abandoned, which is exactly the sort of thing a son-in-law says, and exactly the sort of claim archaeology cannot confirm. The third season went beyond the Tyne, into the country of the Selgove and Votadini in what is now southern Scotland, and reached the estuary of the River Tay, more than 200 kilometers beyond the previous frontier. This is the deepest any Roman force had ever gone into the island. The fourth season consolidated the narrowest part of Britain, the neck between the Firth of Forth on the east coast and the Firth of Clyde on the west, a gap of only about 60 kilometers. Tacitus writes that if the courage of the army and the glory of Rome had allowed it, a boundary would have been found there, and forts were planted across the isthmus. 60 years later, an emperor took exactly that hint and built a wall on that line. The fifth season went into the southwest, into Galloway, looking across the North Channel towards Ireland, which is visible from that coast on a clear day. Agricola apparently believed Ireland could be taken and held with a single legion and a moderate force of auxiliaries, and he kept an exiled Irish prince with him against the possibility. Nobody ever tested the theory. The sixth season crossed the Forth and moved north up the eastern coastal plain, with the fleet working along the shore in support. That naval element solved the problem that had defeated every previous advance, because an army's requirements are measured in tons per day, and tons move very badly along highland tracks and very well by sea. Along the edge of the Highland Massif, where the great glens open onto the plain, the Romans planted a chain of forts at Drumquastle, at Menteith, at Dalgan Ross, at Fendock, and above all, at the mouth of the Tay. The strategy is legible in the archaeology even now, and it is intelligent. Do not go into the mountains after them. Cork the exits. And in that 6th season, with the army operating in separate divisions across difficult country, the Caledonians did something Rome did not expect. They attacked at night. Their target was the 9th Legion, and Tacitus tells us why. They judged it the weakest of the divisions. That is not an insult to the unit. It almost certainly reflects real detachments, men left behind in garrisons and on the supply line and escorting convoys, and a formation running well below its paper strength, which nearly every legion in the empire did nearly all the time. Understand the ground. A Roman marching camp was a rectangle of turf rampart, perhaps 2 meters high, revetted with cut turf blocks, fronted by a ditch cut in a sharp wedge shape and topped with sharpened stakes. There were 4 gates, each covered either by a short length of external ramparts set in front of it or by an interned entrance passage, so that an attacker could not run straight in, but had to turn sideways and expose his unshielded flank. Inside were leather tents, in ordered rows with narrow lanes, the baggage and the animals in the center, the command tent at the crossing of the 2 streets, and sentries posted on the rampart in reliefs through the night. It was designed to stop exactly what happened next, and it was designed on the assumption that any serious attack would come by day, because moving thousands of men across broken country in darkness, silently, and striking a specific gate at a specific moment is genuinely difficult. The Caledonians did it anyway. They came out of the dark, killed the sentries at a gate, and got inside, and the fighting started among the tent lines. That is close to the worst situation a Roman soldier could be in, and the reason is everything we said earlier about formation. He wakes in the dark to screaming and the sound of leather tearing. He does not know how many enemies are inside, or where they are, or which way the rampart lies. His armor is off, because men sleep in tunics. His shield is somewhere in the tent. And the entire basis of his fighting effectiveness is standing shoulder to shoulder with the same 7 men he has shared that tent with for years, which in the dark, in a lane between tents, half-dressed, is precisely what he cannot do. The Roman army's greatest strength becomes irrelevant the moment the men cannot find each other. Agricola had scouts out, got the report, and moved fast. He sent his fastest cavalry and light infantry ahead through the night, with orders to raise a shout as soon as they came within earshot of the camp, so the men inside would know that relief had arrived, which is a small and very human piece of command. At first light, the relief force came in through the gates behind the attackers, while the legionaries inside began to reform. Tacitus writes that as the light came up, the standards flashed, and the Britons, caught between 2 forces, broke and got away into marsh and woodland where cavalry could not follow. Everything about that night matters for this story, and so does what did not happen. The legion was not destroyed. Tacitus is telling the story specifically to demonstrate his father-in-law's brilliance, so he has every reason to make the rescue as dramatic as possible, and he describes a rescue from a serious situation, not the annihilation of a legion. The 9th marches on and fights the following year, but somewhere in the historical memory of the 9th Hispana, from this night onwards, there is a story about darkness in Scotland, and a legion nearly lost, and men dying between the tents. Keep hold of it. An enormous amount has been built on top of it since. The following year, the 7th season, Agricola went looking for a decisive battle, and the Caledonians finally gave him one, at a place Tacitus calls Mons Graupius. Nobody knows where it was. More than 20 candidate sites have been proposed over the last 2 centuries. The strongest is probably the hill of Benacci in Aberdeenshire, a steep, isolated, very distinctive ridge that dominates the surrounding plain, a few kilometers from a Roman marching camp at Durno, which is large enough to have held an army of the right size and which does not fit the pattern of the other camps in the sequence. That identification is a good argument. It is not a fact. The ground, as Tacitus describes it, is simple and easy to picture, and it is the sort of ground that a defending army chooses when it wants to look enormous. The Britons held a hillside, drawn up in tiers, rank above rank up the slope, so that even the rear ranks were visible from below, and the whole mass seemed to fill the sky. On the level ground in front of them, their charioteers drove back and forth making noise. Tacitus gives them more than 30,000 men, and gives their leader, whom he calls Calgacus, a long and magnificent speech about Roman greed and the desolation Rome calls peace, which is a literary composition in the classical tradition and was never spoken by anybody. Roman historians wrote speeches for their characters. That was the convention, and every educated reader knew it. It does not make Tacitus a liar. It does mean the speech is evidence about Tacitus and not about Calgacus. Agricola had something like 11,000 men on the field, and he made a decision that tells you a great deal about the politics of the Roman army. He put 8,000 auxiliary infantry in the center of his line, 3,000 cavalry on the wings, and he kept his legions, including the 9th, drawn up in reserve in front of the camp rampart at the rear. The auxiliaries were not Roman citizens. They were Batavians, Tungrians, Britons, and others recruited from the frontier peoples, and they would do the fighting. If they won, the victory would cost no citizen blood, which was a political asset back in Rome. If they lost, the legions were fresh, uncommitted, and could save the army. It is cold, and it is entirely rational. Because the Britons on the hillside overlapped his line badly, Agricola thinned his ranks and extended his front to avoid being enveloped, and his officers urged him to bring the legions up, and he refused. The battle opened with an exchange of missiles at a distance, and it went nowhere. The Britons had large flat shields and long swords with no point, and they were skilled at batting javelins aside or catching them, and they threw back. Neither side was achieving anything. So Agricola ordered the 4 cohorts of Batavians and 2 of Tungrians to close and get to work with the sword, and this is the moment the battle was decided, and the reason is equipment. The Caledonian longsword was designed for a slashing stroke, which needs room to swing, and the small shield offered little protection at arm's length. The auxiliary carried a large shield with a heavy iron boss and a short pointed blade. So the Batavians walked straight into them, punched with the shield boss to knock a man off balance and open his body, and stabbed underarm into the gap. It is a technique for fighting in a crowd, and a crowd is exactly what the Britons had. On a slope, packed shoulder to shoulder with the ranks behind pressing forward, they could not swing their swords at all. Tacitus says they were pushed so close together that they could not use their weapons, and men were crushed. The Roman line began to grind uphill. The chariots, caught in the shrinking space between the 2 armies, were ridden down by the Roman cavalry and ended up careering into the backs of their own infantry, which is the recurring fate of chariots in this period and the reason they went out of use. Then the Britons, who had never yet been engaged, the ranks standing on the summit, came down off the high ground in a wide movement around the Roman flank, aiming at the rear. That was the correct decision, and it very nearly worked, because Agricola's line was thin and extended and had no depth to give. Agricola had kept 4 cavalry squadrons in hand for exactly this. He threw them in. They met the flanking force head-on, checked it, turned it, and then, instead of pursuing, they rode along the outside of the whole British line and into it from the flank, and rolled it up sideways. After that, it stopped being a battle. Tacitus describes the pursuit across the moor, groups of Britons turning to fight and then breaking again, others running into woodland and setting ambushes for the leading pursuers. Agricola sending cohorts to sweep the woods systematically, the ground scattered with weapons and bodies and abandoned equipment. He gives 10,000 Britons dead against 360 Romans, and once again the ratio tells you it is a claim rather than a count. And then there is the passage that lands hardest, and it is the morning after. Tacitus describes silence on the hills, deserted settlements, houses burning in the distance, no living thing to be met with by the scouts, and the survivors gone into country where nobody could follow. It is one of the coldest paragraphs in Latin literature, and it is a description of a landscape emptied. Now, note what the 9th Legion did at Mons Graupius. It stood in front of the camp rampart in reserve and watched. At the largest battle ever fought in Scotland, the legion whose name is now permanently attached in popular imagination to the idea of disaster in the north never drew a sword. Agricola was recalled in the following year, having governed for an unusually long term. Before he left, his fleet sailed around the top of Britain, confirming for the first time by direct observation that it was an island, and sighted Orkney. It is a genuine geographical achievement, and it was the high water mark of Roman Britain. And then Rome walked away from the whole thing. The most eloquent evidence for that withdrawal sits on a bluff above the River Tay at Inchtuthil in Perthshire. There, the army began to build a permanent legionary fortress, 22 hectares, with 64 barrack blocks, a hospital, granaries, workshops, and a headquarters, intended to hold the legion that would govern the conquered north for the next century. It was never finished. The commander's house had not been started, and within about 3 or 4 years, the order came to abandon it, and the garrison did what Roman soldiers always did on evacuation, which was to leave nothing of use behind. They dismantled the buildings and salvaged the timber. They pulled the nails out, and then, because iron was far too valuable to leave for the tribes and far too heavy to carry south in bulk, they dug a pit more than 3 meters deep in the floor of the workshop, tipped in something in the order of 875,000 iron nails, close to 10 tons of them, ranging from small tacks to spikes the length of a forearm, sealed the pit with nearly 2 meters of packed earth, and marched away. Nobody found it for 1,880 years. The reason for the withdrawal was 2,000 kilometers away. On the Danube, the Dacians under their king Decebalus had destroyed a Roman army, and the emperor Domitian needed troops. Britain had never paid for itself, and it was the obvious place to take them from. The second adiutrix was pulled out and sent east. The garrison of Scotland was progressively evacuated over the following years, fort by fort, and in most cases the fort was deliberately burned on departure so that nothing useful survived. That last detail matters, and we will come back to it, because burnt layers on Roman sites in Scotland are exactly the evidence that later generations would point at and call a catastrophe. By the end of the 1st century, the frontier had come back to a line of forts along the road between the Tyne and the Solway that we call the Stangate, and the country north of it belonged to the people who had always lived there. Rome had conquered Scotland and given it up inside a decade, and it would do the same thing again 60 years later. Meanwhile, on the Danube, the empire was losing legions in the ordinary documented way. In the year 86, the Praetorian prefect Cornelius Fuscus took an army across the Danube into Dacia, and it was destroyed, and the 5th Aladi, the Larks, a legion originally raised by Julius Caesar from Gauls, disappears from the record at about that point, and is generally believed to have died there. In the year 92, the 21st Rapax was destroyed by the Sarmatians on the Middle Danube. 2 legions gone inside 6 years, and although the details are thin, in both cases we have a war, a date, a place, and an enemy. Then came Trajan, and the empire's last great expansion. 2 enormous wars against Dacia, in the years 101 to 102, and again in 105 to 106, ending with the annexation of the province and the suicide of Decebalus, and commemorated on a column in Rome that carries a carved spiral narrative of the whole campaign, one of the most detailed pictures of the Roman army in action that exists. Then the annexation of Arabia. Then, from the year 114, a war against Parthia that took Roman armies down the Tigris to the Persian Gulf. All of that pulled men from everywhere, including Britain, and in Britain the 3 remaining legions settled into the long routine that occupied most of a legion's existence in peacetime, not war, building. The IXth Hispana at York in these years was a construction and administration unit. Its men quarried stone, fired tiles stamped with the legion's name, surveyed and metalled roads, cut timber, made nails, kept accounts, escorted the governor, guarded prisoners, ran a hospital, staffed a records office, and drilled. The great project of the age across the whole empire was converting the timber and turf installations of the conquest period into stone, and at York, the legion rebuilt its own fortress defenses in masonry. And when they completed the main gate, they did what every Roman military unit did on finishing a piece of construction. They put up an inscription saying who had ordered the work and who had done it. That stone survives. It is a slab of gritstone, found in York in the middle of the 19th century, and it records the Emperor Trajan with his full titles, which is how it can be dated precisely. Because the numbers attached to an emperor's offices changed every year, it gives the year we would call 108, and it records that the work was carried out by the 9th Legion Hispana. You can go and stand in front of it today in the Yorkshire Museum, a few hundred meters from where it was set into a wall. It is the last securely dated evidence for the existence of the Ninth Legion anywhere in the Roman Empire. Not the last mention. There are later scraps and we are going to go through every single one of them. But that stone is the last time we can point at a date and say with confidence that on this day this legion existed, in this place, doing this thing. After that, the record thins and stops. And roughly 60 years later, someone in Rome carved a list. It survives on stone, and for military historians, it is one of the most useful documents to come out of the Roman world. It sets out the legions of the empire in geographical order, running around the frontiers province by province, and it belongs to the reign of Marcus Aurelius, most probably the middle of the 160s. It is, in effect, an order of battle for the entire Roman army. For Britain, it lists 3 legions, the 2nd Augusta, the 20th Valeria Victrix, and the 6th Victrix. The 9th Hispana does not appear anywhere on it, in Britain or in any other province. Neither, and this will matter later, does the 22nd Dioteriana, which had been stationed in Egypt. So somewhere in the 60 years between a gate at York and a list in Rome, a legion that had existed since the Roman Republic stopped existing, and not one surviving ancient author says a single word about how. Before we work through the possibilities, it is worth asking a question that sounds technical and is actually the key to the whole subject. How do we know where any Roman legion was at any given time? Not from narrative history mostly. The historians who survive were writing political and moral accounts of emperors and wars, and they mention units when a unit does something notable. For everything else, the evidence is physical, and it comes in 4 forms. The first is building inscriptions, like the York stone. A unit finishes a gate, a granary, an aqueduct, or a stretch of wall, and carves a record of it. These are datable when they name an emperor with his titles, and they place a unit in a specific spot in a specific year. The second is stamped tiles and bricks. Legions ran their own tile works, and they marked their products with the unit's name or abbreviation, partly as ownership and partly as quality control. Find a tile with a legionary stamp in a wall, and you know that legion supplied the material. What you do not necessarily know is when, because tiles were reused for centuries, and you do not know how many men were involved, because a tilery could be run by a detachment of a few dozen. The third is tombstones. A soldier dies and his heirs or his burial club pay for a stone giving his name, his unit, his rank, his years of service, and his age. Thousands survive, and they are the closest thing the Roman army has to a personnel record. The fourth is career inscriptions. Roman senators and equestrians had their entire public career carved on their monuments, post by post, in order, because the sequence of offices was the measure of a man. If a man served as tribune of a legion and later governed a province, and we can date the governorship, we can work backwards through the usual intervals and estimate when he held the tribunate, and therefore when the legion existed. There is a 5th category, which is enormously useful for auxiliary regiments and useless for legions. Auxiliaries who completed 25 years of service received a diploma, a pair of small bronze sheets inscribed with a copy of the imperial grant of citizenship, wired shut, sealed by 7 witnesses, and carried home as proof. Because each diploma lists every auxiliary unit in the province on the date it was issued, they give us dated snapshots of provincial garrisons. Legionaries were already citizens, so they got no diploma, and there is no equivalent document for legions. That absence is one reason the 9th is hard to track. Now put all of that together, and the shape of our problem becomes clear. We are trying to establish the death of an institution using evidence that is very good at saying a unit was somewhere and very bad at saying a unit was nowhere. Absence of evidence in Roman epigraphy is close to worthless as proof, because the survival of any given stone is a lottery, and yet absence of evidence is essentially all we have. With that in mind, let us take the question everybody actually asks first. Was the 9th Legion really wiped out in Scotland? The short answer is that no ancient source says so. Not one. There is no Roman writer, no inscription, no letter, no chronicle entry, no tombstone anywhere in the empire that describes the 9th Hispana marching north of the frontier and failing to return. The story that it did is a modern invention, and we can very nearly date its manufacture. What we have instead is a set of ingredients that look, at a glance, as if they ought to add up. A legion whose last dated appearance is at York. the northernmost legionary fortress in the Roman world. A famous night in Caledonia when that same legion was nearly overrun in its own camp, described in detail by the finest prose writer in Latin, serious trouble in Britain within about a decade of that last inscription. Burnt layers on Roman sites in Scotland. And then, immediately afterwards, the largest fortification Rome ever built anywhere, thrown across northern Britain from sea to sea. Put those 5 things in a row and the human mind will connect them, because that is what the human mind does with sequences. Now take each ingredient apart. The night attack happened around the year 83, a quarter of a century before the York Stone, and the legion survived it, and Tacitus, the source for it, says so explicitly. The burnt layers in southern Scotland belonged to the withdrawal at the end of the 1st century, and the Roman army burned its own installations on evacuation as standard practice, so a burnt fort is at least as likely to be evidence of orderly departure as of disaster. The northernmost fortress is not the same thing as an army in the field, and a legion sitting at York in the year 108 was more than 100 kilometers behind the frontier line, in a settled province, building in stone. And there is a further problem, which for many historians is decisive. Roman legions that disgraced themselves were not quietly forgotten. They were punished, publicly and permanently, and the punishment was aimed at the name. The numbers of the Varus legions were never used again. Units that mutinied were disbanded with dishonor, their standards taken away, their veterans denied benefits, and their titles struck. Rome was a society organized around reputation, and the destruction of a unit's name was a recognized instrument of state. The number 9 stayed in use in the Roman army. Nobody afterwards seems to have treated it as tainted, and no source contains the faintest hint of a disgrace attached to it. Which leaves us with an absence, and absences are the hardest evidence in history to reason from, because they are compatible with almost everything. So take the next question. Why did Hadrian build the wall, and was it built because the 9th was gone? The Emperor Trajan died in August of the year 117 in Cilicia in southern Asia Minor, on the road home from a Parthian war that had reached the Persian Gulf, and then unraveled behind him as the conquered territory rose in revolt. His successor, Hadrian, did something no emperor had done in living memory. He gave land back. Within months, he abandoned the new provinces beyond the Euphrates on the grounds that they could not be held at a price worth paying. And he spent the rest of a 21-year reign converting an empire organized around expansion into an empire organized around defended lines, timber palisades in Germany, roads, ditches, and forts along the desert edge in North Africa. And in Britain, a wall. There was also fighting. The Historia Augusta, a late, patchy, and frequently unreliable collection of imperial biographies, compiled long afterwards and full of invented documents, states in its Life of Hadrian that, at the beginning of the reign, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control. On its own, that clause would carry very little weight. But there is a second and much better source. Marcus Cornelius Fronto was the tutor, correspondent, and lifelong friend of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and in a letter written in the 160s, consoling his former pupil about heavy losses in the Eastern War, he reminds him that under Hadrian, great numbers of Roman soldiers were killed by the Jews and by the Britons. Fronto is writing privately rather than for publication. He has no reason to invent a British disaster, and he expects his correspondent to know what he is talking about. Something happened in Britain in the late 110s, and it cost a significant number of Roman lives. There is supporting archaeology, and it is suggestive rather than conclusive. Coin evidence and building sequences at several northern sites point to disruption and rebuilding in this period. Some forts show destruction and reconstruction, and at Vindolanda, a stone altar and other fragments hint at units being shifted about. None of it names a legion. Hadrian came to Britain in person in the year 122, which emperors did not do casually. He brought with him, or sent immediately before, a new governor, Aulus Platorius Nepos, transferred from the command of Lower Germany, and Platorius Nepos brought a legion with him. The 6th Victrix crossed from the Rhine and went to York, and York is where the 9th Hispana had been. Then they built the thing. From Wallsend on the north bank of the Tyne, where the river meets the sea, to Bonus on the Solway Firth on the west coast, The wall runs 117 kilometers, which is 80 Roman miles, across the narrowest practical neck of northern England. The original design was a stone curtain about 3 meters thick, probably 4 to 5 meters high to the walkway, with a wide, flat-bottom ditch in front of it wherever the ground did not already provide an obstacle. Behind it, a separate and enormous earthwork ran the entire length, a flat-bottom ditch about 6 meters wide and 3 deep, with a mound on each side, marking off the military zone. Along the wall itself, a small fortlet every Roman mile for the whole distance, each with a gate through the wall, and 2 turrets spaced between each pair of fortlets, which gives an observation and signaling point every 490 meters from one coast to the other. As the design evolved, 16 full garrison forts were added astride the line, projecting north of it so that cavalry could be launched forward through their gates. The system continued down the Cumbrian coast in a chain of towers and fortlets, because a wall that can be turned by sea is not a wall. It crosses country that is worth describing, because the animation writes itself. In the middle section, the wall climbs onto the wind sill, a band of hard volcanic rock that surfaces in a series of crags running east to west, with a sheer drop on the northern side and a long dip slope behind. The Roman engineers put the wall along the very lip of it, so that for kilometers at a stretch there is nothing but a black cliff and the wall on top of it and moorland beyond, and the lows lying in the hollows below like spilled metal. It took at least 6 years to build, and the builders were the legions of Britain, the 2nd Augusta, the 20th Valeria Victrix, and the newly arrived 6th Victrix, whose stamped and inscribed stones are still in the fabric, marking off which century built which stretch. So the sequence is real, and it is dramatic. Trouble in Britain, Roman soldiers killed by Britons, an emperor arriving in person, a new legion moving into the 9th's fortress, and the largest fortification in the Western Empire going up across the country immediately afterwards. What that sequence does not contain, anywhere, is a statement that the 9th Hispana was destroyed, and the arrival of the 6th at York does not require it. Legions were transferred between provinces constantly throughout this period, and a change of garrison is not a death certificate. If the 9th had simply been posted elsewhere in those same years, the surviving record would look exactly as it looks now. Which brings us to the third question. Did the 9th Legion actually leave Britain? There is physical evidence that it might have, and it comes from the Netherlands. Nijmegen sits on the Wall, the southern branch of the Rhine Delta in the east of the modern Netherlands, and in Roman times it was Noviomagus, an important base guarding the lower river. The 10th Legion Gemina held the fortress there until about the year 104, when it was pulled out to the Danube for Trajan's Dacian Wars. Something replaced it. Among the Roman material excavated at Nijmegen are roof tiles stamped with the mark of the 9th Legion Hispana. There is also a small piece of silvered bronze harness decoration bearing the legion's name, and there are inscriptions naming officers who served with the 9th and who have connections to the Rhine army. If those tiles were made and used at Nijmegen after the year 120, then the 9th Legion was on the Rhine after it left Britain, and every theory about it dying in Scotland collapses instantly. The Dutch scholar Julius Caesar argued precisely that, and a number of serious historians have followed him. But tiles are difficult witnesses. A legionary tile stamp tells you that men of that legion were present when the tile was made. It does not tell you the year, because tiles are undated objects, and the archaeological context in which they end up may be much later than their manufacture. It does not tell you how many men were there, because a tilery could be operated by a working party of a few dozen. And Roman legions loaned out detachments constantly, for building projects, for garrison duty, for campaigns, in the same way modern armies loan out engineers. There is a real possibility that the Nijmegen material belongs to a detachment sent across from Britain years earlier, or even to a period before the legion ever went to Britain, and the dating of the relevant deposits has been argued over for decades without resolution. There is a second and cleaner strand of evidence, and it is the strongest single argument that the legion outlived Hadrian's Wall. A Roman senator named Lucius Aemilius Carus is recorded as having served early in his career as a military tribune of the 9th Legion Hispana, and he is independently attested as governor of the province of Arabia in the early 140s. Roman senatorial careers moved through a fairly standardized sequence of posts, with fairly standardized intervals, so it is possible to work backwards. Do that, and his tribunate falls somewhere in the 120s, possibly later. If that reconstruction is right, the ninth still existed after the wall was begun, and it cannot have been destroyed in a British war in the late 110s. The reconstruction depends on assumptions about how quickly careers progressed and how long the gaps between posts were, and those assumptions are averages rather than rules, which is the state of this entire subject, and will be until somebody digs up a stone that settles it. So if the legion left Britain alive, where did it go, and what killed it? The answer that has attracted the most support takes us to Judea. In the year 132, the Jewish population of Judea rose against Rome for the third and final time. The leader was Simon bar Kokhba, known to his followers as Bar Kokhba, son of the star, a title with messianic weight taken from a verse in the Hebrew scriptures, and one of the leading rabbinic authorities of the age is reported to have endorsed him as the anointed king, though other rabbis did not. The revolt had been prepared over years. The causes are argued about. Cassius Dio says the trigger was Hadrian's decision to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple, which is a deliberate act of erasure, whatever else it is. Another tradition, also in Dio, says the emperor banned circumcision. The rabbinic sources emphasize religious persecution. Modern historians weigh these differently, and the honest position is that the ban and the refoundation are both attested, and we cannot be certain which came first or which mattered most. The war that followed was not a war of battles. The rebels did not try to hold cities because they had watched what happened at Jerusalem 60 years earlier. They took the countryside, they fortified villages, and above all, they used the geology of the Judean hills, which is soft limestone that can be cut with hand tools. Archaeologists have mapped hundreds of artificial underground complexes beneath village houses, chambers linked by crawl passages deliberately made too narrow for an armored man, with water cisterns, grain stores, ventilation shafts, and hidden entrances. Some of them connect one house to another and out beyond the village boundary. It is an insurgency infrastructure, and it took an enormous amount of labor to build in advance. They held out for 3.5 years. Bar Kokhba ran an administration, leased land, dated documents by the years of the redemption of Israel, and struck his own coinage by overstriking Roman coins, so that the Roman emperor's portrait was hammered flat and replaced with the facade of the temple, and Roman silver was physically converted into Jewish silver. And we have his letters. In caves above the Dead Sea, in the 1950s and 60s, Israeli archaeologists working in near vertical cliff faces found bundles of documents left by refugees who had fled there and died there, including administrative letters written in the name of Simon bar Kokhba himself, on papyrus and wooden slats, giving orders about supplies, about grain, about the treatment of subordinates, about the 4 species needed for the Festival of Tabernacles. Alongside them were household objects, keys, mirrors, cooking pots, and the remains of the people who carried them. Rome had to fight this with everything available. Troops were brought in from across the empire. Eventually, Hadrian recalled his best general, Sextus Julius Severus, from the governorship of Britain and gave him the command, which tells you exactly how serious it had become. Because a governor of Britain was not moved for a minor emergency. Severus did not seek battle. He cut the rebels off, region by region, blockaded the caves and the fortified villages, and starved them out. Cassius Dio gives the numbers. 58,000 killed in the fighting, 985 villages destroyed, 50 fortified places taken, and vast numbers besides, who died of hunger, disease, and fire. So that, in his phrase, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. The province was renamed. Jews were barred from Jerusalem. And then Dio adds a detail about the Roman side which is worth more than any casualty figure. When Hadrian wrote to the Senate reporting the victory, he omitted the customary opening formula in which an emperor stated that he and the army were in good health. Roman official letters were formulaic, and the formula existed precisely so that its absence would be noticed. Losses had been heavy enough that the emperor could not write the sentence. The 22nd Dioteriana was stationed in Egypt, immediately next door, and it disappears from the record at almost exactly this time. And it is absent from that same list of legions carved in Rome in the 160s. Almost every historian accepts that the 22nd died in or around this war. So the argument runs like this. If the 9th left Britain alive, and if it was on the Rhine in the 120s, and if Aemilius Carus served with it as late as the reconstruction suggests, then it was available, in the right decade, when the empire was scraping together every unit it could find for the most costly insurgency it ever fought. And a legion destroyed in that war would leave exactly the record we have, which is none, because our narrative sources for it are a summary of Dio and a handful of rabbinic traditions. What the argument lacks is any positive evidence that the 9th was ever in the East at all. Not a stone, not a tile, not a tombstone. It is an argument from opportunity. And there is one more possibility, later still. In the year 161, at the very start of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Parthians invaded Armenia. The governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, marched to meet them with a legion, and at a place called Elegia on the upper Euphrates, he was surrounded, and his force was annihilated. Dio says the whole legion was destroyed. Severianus killed himself after 3 days. Fronto, writing to console Marcus Aurelius afterwards, refers to the disaster and to Roman armies destroyed in the course of the reign. Nobody knows for certain which legion died at Elegia. Several scholars have proposed the 9th Hispana. That would place its destruction 4 years before the list of legions on which it does not appear, which fits with almost suspicious neatness, and neatness is precisely the reason to be careful, because theories that fit too well are usually being helped along by the person proposing them. Step out of the argument for a while, because underneath all of this, there is a question the theories never touch. What was it actually like to be one of these men, not the legion as a counter on a map? The 5,000 individuals who woke up in that fortress at York in the year 108 and had a day, we can answer that with unusual precision, and the reason is a bog in Northumberland. At Vindolanda, a fort on the Stangate Road just south of the line where Hadrian's Wall was later built, a sequence of timber forts was built, demolished, leveled and built over again across about 40 years. Each time, the floors of the old fort were sealed under clay and turf, which cut off the oxygen, and the resulting waterlogged anaerobic layers preserved organic material that anywhere else would have rotted away within a decade. Leather, textile, wood, rope, hair, food, and writing. Out of that mud have come more than 1,000 writing tablets, thin slivers of birch and alder, about the size of a modern postcard, scored and folded, written on in carbon ink with a reed or a metal nib, and thrown away. They date from roughly the year 90 to the year 120, which is exactly the period of the 9th Legion's last decades. This is the day-to-day paperwork and the private correspondence of the Roman frontier army in Britain, and nothing else remotely like it survives from anywhere in the empire. Here is what it shows. A strength report of the first cohort of Tungrians survives, and it does something no narrative history ever does. It records the unit's total at over 750 men, including centurions, and then records how many were actually present at the fort on that particular morning, which was fewer than 300. The rest were away, detached to another fort, escorting the governor on assignment elsewhere. Of the men present, a number were listed as unfit for duty, some sick, some wounded, and 10 men suffering from inflammation of the eyes. That is a Roman army unit as it really existed on a given day, under strength, scattered across 3 places at once, and with 10 men who could not see properly. There is a memorandum in which a Roman officer sets down his professional assessment of the enemy. He observes that the Britons have no armor, that there are a great many cavalry, that the cavalry do not use swords, and that the natives do not take up fixed positions in order to throw their javelins. And he refers to them throughout with a contemptuous diminutive that translates roughly as the wretched little Britons. It is the earliest surviving example of a soldier in these islands being rude about the locals in writing. There is a letter concerning a consignment sent up to the frontier for a soldier, and the list includes socks, 2 pairs of sandals and underpants, which tells you more about a Northumbrian winter than any climate reconstruction. There are requests for beer, repeatedly. A decurion writes to ask that beer be sent to his men because they have none, and the drink is named with the Celtic word for it, which means the Roman army in Britain had adopted the local product and depended on it. There are accounts of grain and of the daily issue of wheat to named individuals. There are shopping lists that include pepper, which came from southern India by ship to the Red Sea, and then overland and across the Mediterranean and up through Gaul to a fort in Northumberland, so that somebody could season his dinner. And there is the tablet that people queue up to see. Claudia Severa, the wife of a commander at a nearby fort, wrote to Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the commander at Vindolanda, inviting her to come for her birthday celebration, and telling her that her presence would make the day more enjoyable. Most of it is written by a household secretary in a professional hand. At the end, in a second, less practiced hand, there are a few lines added by Severa herself, greeting her friend and calling her sister. It is the earliest known writing in Latin by a woman anywhere in the Roman world, and it was recovered from a rubbish layer at the outer edge of the empire. Around that paperwork sits the material life, and the material life is startlingly well supplied. The basic ration was wheat, issued raw. Soldiers ground it themselves in hand querns of imported stone, and the bread was baked in ovens built into the back of the rampart, well away from the timber barracks, in domed structures that were heated with a fire, raked out, and then loaded. On top of that, bacon and lard and ham, because pork was the meat of the Roman army, along with beef, mutton, chicken, and venison, lentils and beans and peas, cheese, salt, eggs, honey, apples and plums, oysters, carried inland packed in seaweed, and eaten in enormous quantities on sites 100 kilometers from the sea. Olive oil came from the valley of the Guadalquivir in southern Spain in fat globular amphorae that weighed around 30 kilograms empty and held roughly 70 liters, shipped by sea and hauled up rivers across the whole width of Europe so that a man in Yorkshire could cook the way a man in Italy cooked. Fish sauce came the same way, in smaller jars, made from fermented fish guts and salt, and it was the standard flavoring of the Roman world on everything. Wine came in barrels of silver fir cut in the Alps, and the barrels were reused afterwards as well linings, which is how we know about them. They ate off Samian ware, the glossy orange-red tableware mass-produced in industrial quantities in workshops in southern and central Gaul, molded, decorated in relief, and stamped underneath with the name of the potter or the workshop. It was shipped in crates, packed with straw, and it was cheap enough that an ordinary soldier could own a decent set of it. That last point is worth pausing on, because the disappearance of that pottery from the archaeological record 2 centuries later is one of the clearest signals we have of an economy coming apart. In the year 108, it was arriving by the shipload, and a broken plate was an annoyance rather than a disaster. They wore hobnailed leather boots, and Vindolanda has produced thousands of shoes. Military boots, civilian shoes, elegant women's footwear with cutwork decoration, and small children's shoes in a fort that officially housed no families whatsoever. Some of the shoes are so worn on one side that you can see how their owner walked. They played board games and lost the counters. They combed their hair and beards with fine-toothed boxwood combs, some of which came out of the ground, still holding the lice and the nits. They kept dogs, and the dogs walked across the drying tiles. They wrote curses on sheets of lead when someone stole from them, and at the sacred hot spring at Bath, 130 of these have been recovered from the water, complaining in detail about stolen cloaks, gloves, bracelets, and cash, naming suspects, and asking the goddess to deny the thief sleep, health, and children until the property came back. One of them concerns a bathing tunic, and it names both possible culprits so the goddess can decide. They worshipped a great many things at once, and this is the part modern audiences find hardest to hold in their heads. The official religion of the unit was the cult of the standards and the imperial house, with a calendar of festivals observed on fixed days, sacrifices to Jupiter best and greatest, and the birthdays of past emperors marked with ceremony. Alongside that, every man kept whatever gods he had brought with him. On Hadrian's wall, you find altars to Jupiter, to Mars, to Hercules, to the eastern god Jupiter Dolicanus, whose worship came out of Syria. to the Persian god Mithras in underground chapels built for small male congregations, to Germanic and Gaulish deities imported by auxiliary regiments, and to purely local British gods whose names appear nowhere else on earth, sometimes paired with a Roman name so that the two were worshipped as one. There was no contradiction in this. Religion in the Roman army was a matter of not neglecting anybody. And they died, and the people who cared about them paid for stones. At York there is the tombstone of a standard-bearer of the 9th Legion named Lucius Ducius Rufinus, a man from Vienne in southern Gaul, on the Rhone, carved in relief holding his standard, dead in his 20s, and buried something like 1,500 kilometers from the town he came from. There was a stone put up by a father named Quintus Corellius Fortis for his daughter Corellia Optata, who died at the age of 13, and whose epitaph speaks of the shades of the underworld and asks the reader to grieve. There is the memorial of a woman named Julia Velva, whose heir set up a stone showing the family reclining at a funeral banquet, with instructions that he had made it for himself and his family in his own lifetime. There are freedmen, slaves, merchants from the Rhineland, and Greeks a very long way from home. That is what disappeared, whenever and wherever it disappeared. Not an abstraction and not a formation on a map. A society of about 5,000 men, plus wives who were not legally wives, plus children who were not legally legitimate, plus slaves and traders and potters and prostitutes and priests, with a payroll, a hospital, a savings bank, a religious calendar, a rubbish problem, and a graveyard. Now, let us weigh it up properly. What do serious historians actually argue about here, and how strong is each case? The oldest position, and still the one with by far the most public traction, is that the 9th was destroyed in Britain between about the year 117 and the year 122. It was the position of Theodore Mommsen, the greatest Roman historian of the 19th century, and it has been defended by good scholars ever since. Its supporters point to Fronto's private letter about Roman soldiers killed by Britons under Hadrian, to the Historia Augusta's line about Britain being out of control, to the emperor's personal visit, to the transfer of the 6th Victrix into the 9th's own fortress, to signs of disruption on northern sites, and to the extraordinary decision to commit 3 legions to building a permanent wall across the island. It is a coherent case, and every item in it is real evidence. What it lacks is a single ancient statement connecting that war to that legion. And it has a specific problem we established earlier with the Boudican Revolt. Losing men did not destroy a legion. The 9th lost its entire field force in the year 60 and was operational again within a year. For a British war to have ended the legion permanently, it would have had to destroy not just a detachment, but the headquarters, the cadre, the archive, and the eagle, all at once, in a province where the legion had a walled fortress to fall back on. The second position is that the 9th left Britain alive and died somewhere else. Its supporters point to the stamped tiles and the harness fitting at Nijmegen, argued most forcefully by Bogaers, to the career of Aemilius Carus, and to the plain fact that legions were transferred between provinces routinely, and that the arrival of a replacement at York proves nothing about the fate of the unit it replaced. The natural continuation of that story is Judea, where a sister legion certainly did vanish in a war so costly that an emperor edited his own victory dispatch. A minority push it 4 years later still to Alesia in Armenia. What that position lacks is any positive attestation of the 9th outside Britain and the Rhine. Nothing places it in Syria, Judea, Egypt, or Cappadocia. It is an argument built on plausibility and opportunity, and plausibility is not evidence. The third position is the least dramatic and the most uncomfortable, which is that nothing cinematic happened at all. Legions could be run down by continuous detachment until the parent unit was a shell. They could be amalgamated, which Rome had done before, and the name Gemina, meaning twin, carried by several legions, records exactly that. They could be disbanded after a mutiny, a mass desertion, or a plague. And the Great Plague that swept the empire from the year 165 onwards killed on a scale that is hard to estimate and certainly hit army units hard. A unit that dwindled and was quietly struck off would leave precisely the record we have, which is nothing at all. The objection to this is that Rome cared intensely about legionary identity, and the wholesale disappearance of an ancient formation without ceremony sits oddly with everything else we know about Roman military culture. But it is not impossible, and it deserves to be on the table. And underneath all three sits the reason we are having this conversation at all, which is not mysterious in the least. It is that the 2nd century is a hole in the sources. For the 1st century, we have Tacitus, one of the greatest historians who ever lived, who happened to marry the daughter of a governor of Britain and who therefore had reason to write about the island in detail. We have Suetonius. We have parts of Dio. For the decades after the year 120, we have almost nothing comparable. Dio's account of this period survives largely through the summaries made by Byzantine scholars 1,000 years later, who kept what interested them. The Historia Augusta is a late compilation, which invents documents, invents authorities, and in places invents entire emperors. Whole reigns pass in a few paragraphs. There is no narrative history of Britain in the 2nd century. None, at any point. So we do not know what happened to the 9th Legion, for the same reason we do not know a great many other things about those decades. Not because it was covered up, and not because it was too shameful to record, but because the books that would have told us were not copied often enough to survive, and the men who could have told us are under the ground. That is a much duller answer than a legion marching into the mist. It is also, on the evidence, the likeliest one. Which finally lets us deal with the eagle, and with the question that brought a very large number of people to this subject in the first place. Is the story of the lost 9th true? And where did it come from? In 1866, excavators, working in the Roman town of Caieva Atribatum at Silchester in Hampshire, were digging in the Basilica, the great public hall, on one side of the forum. In the floor deposits, they found a small bronze eagle, about 15 centimeters high, wings broken off in antiquity, the modeling good, the surface corroded. The Victorian excavators, working in a layer they interpreted as burnt debris, reached the conclusion that seems obvious once you have thought of it. This was the eagle of a legion, hidden or abandoned when the town met a violent end. Later scholarship reached a much duller conclusion, and the duller conclusion is almost certainly correct. The object is not a legionary standard. Legionary eagles were larger, were made of precious metal, and had the wings raised in a specific display posture. This eagle's wings were outstretched, and the figure belongs to a well-known type of statuary in which an eagle stands at the foot of a statue of Jupiter, of which examples are known from across the empire. It is a fragment of a religious statue group from a public building, which is exactly what you would expect to find in a basilica. There is nothing whatsoever connecting it to any legion, let alone the 9th, and the burnt deposit interpretation has not held up either. But in the early 1950s, a novelist read the Victorian account of the find, and read separately about a Roman legion that had been stationed at York and had left no record of its end, and joined the two facts together. Rosemary Sutcliffe published The Eagle of the 9th in 1954. In it, a young Roman officer invalided out of the army travels north beyond the frontier in disguise with a British companion to recover the standard of the legion his father died with. It has never been out of print. It has been read by several generations of British schoolchildren. It was serialized for radio and adapted for television, and it stands directly behind two modern feature films, Centurion in 2010 and The Eagle in 2011, and behind a great deal of what you will find if you search for this subject online. That is where the legend comes from, not from Tacitus, not from any inscription. From a Victorian misidentification of a piece of statuary, plus a gap in the epigraphic record, plus a very good children's novel written in the 1950s by an author who was writing fiction, knew perfectly well that she was writing fiction, and produced something so vivid that 70 years later, a large part of the public takes it for the historical record. That is not a failure of history. It is a demonstration of how history gets made, and it should make you slightly suspicious of every other confident story you have ever been told about the ancient world, including some of the ones in this video, which is why we have flagged the sources as we went. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is about what happened next at York, because the fortress did not die with its garrison. The 6th Victrix took over the site and stayed for the rest of the Roman period, close to 300 years. It rebuilt the fortress in stone on a grander scale. The civilian settlement across the river grew into a full city and was granted the highest municipal status the empire could award, which made its leading citizens, Roman citizens, of a self-governing town rather than provincials. And York became, twice, the center of the Roman world. In the year 208, the Emperor Septimius Severus came to Britain in person with his sons and an enormous army, campaigned in Scotland with the intention of finishing what Agricola started, failed to bring the Caledonians to a decisive battle, and died at York in the year 211, so that for 3 years the capital of the empire was effectively a fortress town in Yorkshire. A century later, the Emperor Constantius came to Britain, campaigned in the north, and also died at York in the year 306, and his troops immediately proclaimed his son, emperor, on the spot. That son was Constantine, and the reign that began in a fortress by the Ouse ended with the Roman Empire officially Christian and a new capital on the Bosphorus. You can still see a piece of it. The Multangular Tower in the Museum Gardens at York, a 10-sided stone bastion built in the early 4th century, stands to a considerable height, with its Roman courses at the bottom and medieval work on top. And it sits at the western corner of the fortress that the 9th Legion laid out in turf and timber in the year 71. So here is where the evidence actually leaves us. A legion raised in the Roman Republic, which fought for Julius Caesar in Gaul and stood in the line at Pharsalus, which mutinied and was very nearly decimated, which took its name from a mountain war in Spain, which garrisoned the Danube, campaigned in North Africa, invaded Britain in the first wave, was destroyed on a road in East Anglia, and rebuilt in a winter, marched further north than any Roman formation ever would again, watched the largest battle ever fought in Scotland from the reserve line, and finally built a fortress at York, and signed its name to a gate in the year 108, disappears from history at some point in the following half-century, in a place unknown, in a manner unknown, for reasons unknown. Everything beyond that is argument. And here is the thing about it that stays with me. There was a last day. There has to have been. Somewhere there was a final morning parade, and the eagle came out of the shrine into the cold, and men answered to their names, and a clerk noted the ration strength, and the day was completely ordinary. Because nobody knows they are standing at the end of something. If the end came in battle, then the men in that line believed they were fighting a battle. They were thinking about the ground, and the man beside them, and whether the reserve would come up, and how much water was left. They were not thinking about the extinction of an institution founded before the emperors existed. Soldiers never are. Nobody in that column in East Anglia in the year 60 thought they were living through a chapter of a documentary. And if the end came slowly, which is at least as likely, then it happened in a sequence of entirely reasonable administrative decisions, each one signed off by a competent official solving that month's problem. A cohort detached to reinforce the Rhine, a working party sent to build, a draft transferred east because the emperor needs men, and this province is quiet. A depleted unit merged into another because it is not worth maintaining 2 headquarters. Every one of those decisions is defensible on the day it is taken. The sum of them is the disappearance of a legion, and the sum was probably never visible to anybody because nobody in the Roman administration was standing far enough back to see it. That is almost always how it works. People do not experience the end of the thing they belong to. They experience a difficult year, followed by a reorganization, followed by a posting somewhere else. The name comes off a list in an office 2,000 kilometers away, and the men who carried it are already dispersed, or dead, or serving under a different number and a different eagle. And the last person alive who could have explained it never wrote it down, because it never occurred to him that anyone would ask. 2,000 years later, we are still asking. That is the only monument the 9th Legion has left, and on the whole, it is a better one than most. Thank you for staying with this all the way to the end. It genuinely matters, and if you got something out of it, a like and a subscribe are the 2 things that make long-form history like this possible to keep making. Now settle the argument properly, with all the evidence in front of you. Where did the 9th Legion end? Killed in Britain, in the war that Hadrian's Wall was built to prevent from happening again. Shipped out alive, and burned out in the tunnels and hill villages of Judea alongside the 22nd, or ground down quietly by detachment, transfer, and amalgamation until there was nothing left to disband and a clerk struck the name off a list. Pick one. Tell us why in the comments, and be specific about the evidence, because somebody will absolutely argue with you. See you in the next video.